A recent survey by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development surveyed citizens in the more developed nations around the world, what we call the first world, and their question was about their attitudes toward climate change, particularly global warming. The survey shows that 60% of citizens in the developed nations of the world believe that climate change will very likely lead to the end of mankind and that it will probably happen in this generation. Now, that doesn't surprise me because the results of those kinds of polls are often overblown because the whole conversation in the West about climate change is overblown. But how do we think about these issues biblically? That's what we need to talk about. If it is true that mankind is facing imminent destruction, then certainly we should do everything in our power to deal with it. If the world will end in 12 years, like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez claimed in 2019, then certainly any action to prevent that happening, politically speaking, economically speaking, any action would be justified. If you think the world is ending, then climate change is the equivalent of a giant meteor that is hurtling towards Earth. And if that's the reality, then all of this political rhetoric makes perfect sense. The problem is that the reality? The UN Secretary General, along with Western leaders of developed nations, including the current administration in the United States, they tend towards that apocalyptic view. They tell us the world is facing a grave climate emergency. Every week they come out with new climate-related devastation. The floods, the drought, the heat waves, the wildfires, superstorms. We're in a battle for our lives, they tell us. Climate change is the biggest threat to the global economy that mankind has ever seen. I didn't even know superstorms was a word, but apparently it's a hot topic these days. Did you know that when we look at the actual facts, I know facts are not in vogue right now because opinions are much more fun. Feelings are much more exciting. But did you know that factually speaking, this business of superstorms or Category 3 and above hurricanes, that's basically what a superstorm is. Did you know that the annual number of hurricanes that are making landfall in the United States since 1900, over 120 years of data, the actual number of hurricanes is declining and not increasing? Did you know that the same thing can be said if we look at world data for total hurricane energy in the satellite era, which is 1980 to today? In that period, 2022 was the second lowest recorded year ever for global hurricane activity. Have you heard that reported anywhere? Absolutely not, because it doesn't fit the narrative. What about the supposed increase in wildfires? The Maui fires had only been burning for a day when all of a sudden we're barraged with the description that this was the natural consequence of climate change. Nobody bothered to stop and say, no. The fires in Maui, the fires in Montana, the fires in several places around the world, fires in Spain that have just been unfolding. What we found upon investigation is those fires were started by arson. It is human activity causing the wildfires, but not human activity that produces climate change. It's just bad people doing bad things. Well, why do they burn so out of control? Because we've had poor wildlife management policies in this country for so many years that we no longer tend our wilderness. We don't burn back the underbrush. We don't do the things that minimize the spread of wildfires. Why would we want to minimize them when the increase in wildfires would fit this narrative that the world is hurtling towards an apocalyptic finish? And yet, even here, We were told in 2020 that the whole continent of Australia was burning to a crisp, wildfires sweeping across the nation. Except that for all of the media coverage of those Australian wildfires, when you now look at the satellite imagery that happened during that time period, we find out that while those wildfires were serious, they were less total geographical space burned in 2020 in Australia than in previous years. It's a normal process to have wildfires in the wilderness. In fact, those 2020 wildfires were considered by Australians to be one of the lowest levels of burning in Australia as a whole in recent memory. But that's not what we're being told. There's been a dramatic decline over the last 25 years in burned area globally from wildfires. Here's the thing that nobody ever talks about. Humans have a wonderful ability to adapt to circumstances, and we never seem to include that in conversations about climate. We talk about what climate is going to do, and we blame humans for the results, but we never talk about what can happen. Do you know that in the 1920s, about 500,000 people, 500,000 people per year on average died due to climate-related disasters? 500,000 people per year. In the 2010s, almost 100 years later, the average number of people dying globally as a result of climate is down to about 18,000, and in 2022, the number was 11,000. That downward trend, again, doesn't fit the narrative, but it's facts that we never hear about. A big reason for those downward numbers is because humans have developed the resources and the technology to mitigate a lot of those disasters. We've improved predictive abilities. People don't die from tornadoes the way they once did because we have a better ability to predict them and to take cover and to protect. We make progress and we mitigate these sort of natural things. And the reality is they're not increasing. The only thing that's increasing in natural disasters is media coverage of those disasters. Many people say that they're worried about sea levels rising. And the fact is, if climate change is real, if the polar ice caps, which by the way are growing in ice, if they were to melt, in fact, as water heats up, it expands. The rising of the oceans would be a serious problem. But here's the thing. It's not, even if that was true, it's not like humans are going to stand on the beach for the next 80 years and wait to drown. There will be innovation. There will be movement. We will adapt to changing circumstances as we always have. Holland is a perfect example of that. The airport in Holland, the Schiphol Airport, is the 14th largest airport in the world. The airport is actually on the site of one of the most significant naval battles in World War II, the naval battle of Schiphol. But Holland, in the years since World War II, used technology to claim that space, and what was once ocean has now become a land extension of their nation, sufficient enough to serve as the 14th largest airport in the world. There are lots of current proposals that we could look at that would have dramatic impact on the way that we face any changes in climate in the years ahead. The problem is the policies that we seem to be so wedded to, we now know they don't work. I mean, think about it this way. At the turn of the 20th century, in the 19th century, whales were almost hunted to extinction because the bulk of the U.S. and Europe used whale oil as their primary source of energy for burning. The whales weren't saved because we passed a law that made it illegal to burn whale oil. They were saved because we discovered oil in Pennsylvania, which was cheaper to access and easier to develop and transport. Every time we have a challenge, we face it with human adaptability and innovation. That is something that the progressive left today refuses to acknowledge. Why is that? Could it be because the policies that don't work, that they seem to be so wedded to, have an entirely different motive to them? Maybe it's not dealing with the changing environment that we may be facing. Maybe it has to do with the redistribution of wealth and the consolidation of power. Oh, but see, that makes me a climate change denier to suggest that. No, I'm not suggesting that the climate is not changing. I think climate perpetually changes. What I'm suggesting is the people who are coming up with the solutions are the ones who have everything to gain by it. And when the president says he's coming for our gas stoves and our gas water heaters, he doesn't care one whit about your gas stove or your gas water heater, but he works for people who want your money and your control. Well, so what do? We push back on these kinds of bizarre and absurd approaches. Whether climate change is or is not a real problem, it would help all of us if we could actually and objectively examine the data that we have over the last couple of 100 years, instead of having politicians screaming their talking points and their bumper sticker slogans trying to convince us to do something that we're not going to do. See, here's the thing. They're going to wreck the American economy by imposing an agenda that will do tremendous damage to our ability to be productive and competitive in the world. And guess what? It's not going to change global levels of CO2 but a minuscule amount, because the greatest offenders of this climate crime are countries like China and India, and they are not on board with making these changes. We're telling people in Africa who are burning charcoal just to be able to survive that they can no longer do that because they're damaging the globe. Isn't it always interesting that it's the people who already have theirs who are imposing the rules on the people who are just trying to scratch out a living? Well, how do we process this biblically? What's our response? They want us to stop driving. They want us to stop using fossil fuels. They want us to turn to so-called clean, green energy, even though clean, green energy doesn't work. Do you know that if you were to fly an airplane from New York to Paris and it was battery powered, it at least right now, until we come up with better innovation, that's an impossibility, because the weight of the batteries necessary to power that plane across the ocean creates a weight that makes even more batteries necessary in order to move that load. And you can never get enough batteries with enough power to compensate for the weight of a plane trying to fly across the ocean. So if we say, okay, we're only going to use clean energy and we're going to move away from fossil fuels, you have, in a sense, taken us back 1,000 years in our ability to travel and move around and be mobile as human beings. Well, how does this play out in other ways? Let me tell you an interesting story. There is an organization in North Carolina that is simply titled, very straightforwardly, the organization is titled Stop Having Kids. That's it. They promoted a demonstration at Pritchard Park in Asheville, North Carolina this summer. The group supports abortion, and they are antinatalists, which means that they're against childbearing. They have strict goals of population control. They frankly want people to quit having babies. In fact, part of their movement, part of the documents that they produce, the pamphlets that are part of their movement, is this quote. They said, you can eliminate, this is a quote, an unconscionable amount of needless suffering, injustice, and death in the world by just not bringing people into the world. Well, isn't that fascinating? Not bringing someone into existence can actually be an act of love. You can feel morally superior. They say this, having kids is the worst thing you can do for the environment. Well, if innovation is the key to our future, then how many Einsteins and Teslas and Edisons and other brilliant scientists that would lead us in innovation are being aborted by those who say, oh, no, don't have children. You're hurting the environment. Here's the only encouraging thing about the Stop Having Kids movement. That rally in Asheville, North Carolina that I told you about, the press showed up to cover the rally, and they only had one thing to report, and that was no one showed up. No one was interested. Why? Because the average human being understands the stupidity of that kind of attitude, and they know that marriage between a man and a woman for life that produces the bearing, the nurture, the raising, the training of children, that not only is the default setting for human existence and community, but it is also the key to everything good that we hope will happen in the future. Well, where are we biblically on this? Let me read these 3 verses from Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis 1, as a part of the creation account, it simply says, Then God said, Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. God gave us 2 charges when he created man and woman, and those 2 charges have never changed. One is spread over the earth, be fruitful and multiply. In other words, have children, produce the next generation. But then he said, then take the world that I've given you and subdue it. Have dominion over it. That doesn't mean that we're careless, that we're irresponsible. In fact, it's just the opposite. It means that God has delegated to us a stewardship of the world. But what we have today in radical environmentalist policy is not stewardship or caretaking of the world. We have replaced dominion and stewardship and caretaking with worship. We have made the earth a god, and we are willing to sacrifice human life, human productivity, human culture and society because of this unattainable goal that somehow we will preserve a pristine earth that will exist forever and ever. First of all, the earth was created specifically as a platform for human life. That is the purpose of the earth. The earth is not more important than humans. We are more important than the earth. And secondly, the truth of the matter is, the earth is not going to exist forever, not in its present state. It wasn't intended to. It will serve its purpose. In the right time, God will recreate it, and it will be the garden that once was in Eden, that God always intended, as the place where humans in relationship with God would exist. Let us take seriously climate issues, but if we're going to steward creation, let us look at the facts and make smart moves. Let us get off this roller coaster ride of political ideologies that are advancing climate change as a cover for the amassing of wealth and the consolidation of power. These people are not your friends. These people are buying beachfront houses. Don't listen to them. Find your way to the Word of God. Be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, and rule over it. These charges from God have never changed. This is Truth Currents.